you're live. I'm just waiting a bit for the phone just to see if I'm really live.
Okay.
Oh, really live? You're being done. Okay. I cut this part off afterwards.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the Grand Multiliteracy event. And I'm very pleased to welcome Katherine Nelson to talk about a very important topic that is the science of reading and language acquisition. Because when we talk about literacy and multilingualism, there are many questions and worries regarding how one language could interfere with the learning process of the other. So thank you very much for being here with us, Katherine.
Thank you.
And so before we start, I would like to introduce you to our viewers. And of course, feel free to add anything else you want.
Okay.
So Katherine Nelson is an experienced educator specializing in early literacy for multilingual learners. She has a dual master's degree in TESOL and Literacy and over a decade of teaching experience. For the past several years, Katherine has worked as a consultant and curriculum developer for EdTech platforms and educational companies, focusing on language acquisition and literacy learning. She also publishes her own books and material for beginning English learners through her company, Dovetail Readers. And especially for this event, she's giving away a copy of her new book, which is called Folk Tales Phonics, Traditional Tales for Beginning Readers. You can find all the details in the program, and I left the links as well in the description of this video. So welcome, Katherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be able to share my perspective and learn from the other speakers you have for the rest of the weekend.
Thank you. And so we're going to start with the first question. So could you first explain your professional journey and what led you to be interested in early literacy, especially multilingual learners?
Sure. So I kind of fell into English as a second language, is what it was called when I first began teaching. After college, I joined the New York City Teaching Fellows program, where you're assigned to schools that are having trouble staffing their building. And I was assigned to English as a second language because it was an area where they were having particular trouble finding teachers. But it meant that I was completely unprepared for education because I had not majored in education or had any courses. So I was really learning on the job and attending, university at night. But most of my learning happened in the classroom with the students. And I started working in a pre-kindergarten through third grade school. And for anybody who has taught those grades, literacy and learning to read is really what you spend the majority of the day doing. And so I quickly came to realize that I needed to have a strong understanding of how literacy is developed, and in my particular case for multilingual learners, because that was the population I was working with. And although my English as a second language degree was pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, I really had not received adequate preparation on the mechanics of how children learn to read. We spent a lot of time on comprehension and vocabulary development, but not on the basics of how kids learn to connect sounds with letters on a page.
Yeah.
So a couple of years later, I moved to a more suburban district and found I was still struggling with the same things, of just feeling like there was this huge gap in my knowledge. And I ended up going back to school and getting my second master's degree in literacy and signing up for every professional development and webinar that I could find. And really try to make this like the focus of my career, to understand how multilingual students develop those very early stages of literacy in grades K through 2. And for the past 5 years or so, as you mentioned, I've been working outside of the classroom in the curriculum and material side of things, which has been a very interesting extra layer to my perspective on the need for educators to be fully trained in both language acquisition and literacy development, and how the materials that we use affect the learning that we can elicit with our students.
Yeah, it's so important to base it on research and science and not just go with our gut feeling or with people you tell me I need to do it that way, so I repeat the same thing without really understanding. So it's great to have you here. And just for the viewers who are following us at the moment, just to remind you that so we have these live sessions, so you can ask your own questions. I have my phone on the side, so I can see your questions and I can ask them to Catherine when it comes up. And so now we'd like to talk about so parents are often worried about the possible negative impact of home languages. So the impact it could have on the school language. There is like this duality between both, and maybe one is bad for the other. Whether it could confuse them when they learn to read and write, etc. And so I was wondering if you knew where these fears came from. Yeah, where do these myths come from? Because like more than half of the world speaks more than two languages or more. So why do we have these fears?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of an enduring misunderstanding. And in fact, the research does not bear that out and shows the opposite. The more rich language foundation we can give children, no matter what language it's in, that sets the stage for literacy development in every language. So, um, and I'll also say, I don't think it's just families who have that misconception. Unfortunately, I still hear that piece of advice being recommended to families sometimes of only speak English. And I think it comes from this misunderstanding that immersing yourself in a language means you have to reject all your other languages to fully immerse yourself in one. Um, but again, the research doesn't bear that out. And I think the other piece of that fear is a recognition that, at least in US schools, the way that they're currently structured, English is necessary in order to achieve academically. And I'm not saying that that's the way that it should be, but it is the reality of schools right now. And I think
Yeah,
that this fear from parents reflects their understanding of how important it is for their child to be able to acquire English in a timely fashion. And ideally, we want them to also be maintaining their first language as well. And I
yeah,
think if we can get that message across to parents that using your first language with the child, or all of the languages that they speak, is going to support their English development as well.
yeah.
Um, that's really what we want them to understand.
Thank you very much. And I guess it's also because so these myths are widespread, especially in monolingual countries, where so the adults who are the professionals, the teachers, etc., maybe they haven't grown up that way. So for them, if they start learning another language, they feel like it would actually, as adults, it doesn't affect us. We just maybe we struggle with learning a language, but we don't feel like it's impacting our first language. So, but yeah, I guess it's because it's in monolingual countries that it's more widespread.
Yes. And I think also, at least in the US, there's a shortage of bilingual and multilingual teachers as well. And so the fact that our schools are mostly staffed with monolingual um, teachers, it does make it harder again to dispel some of these myths. And so I think that's a really important direction for education to move in, is to recruit more bilingual teachers as well, and to honestly to make more students multilingual, so that we
Yeah,
can start to break down some of that monolingual bias.
yeah. And so now, so when I prepared these events, this event, I got people to ask me questions. What were the challenges and questions? So I would like to ask you some of them that came back often, for you to answer them. So the first one was, when is the best time to teach a child to read and write in their home language? Is it before they go to school, after, or at the same time? Yeah, when is the best time? Is there anything that science says?
So I'm not aware of a definitive answer on the best time to start other than to observe your child for signs of readiness.
Yeah,
So regardless of what language your child is learning to read, um, you're going the same sort of principles need to be in place. So we want to be developing phonemic awareness, which can happen in any language. If you can encourage your child to play rhyming games or to try to break off the first sound of a word, that's not specific to English. That's a skill that can be used across languages. And the
yeah,
same is true for building background knowledge and vocabulary. Those are all things that will transfer to future languages. So I would recommend to parents that if you see your child, reading through books, trying to approximate what you've read to them, if you see them playing with the sounds and words, and if you see them being interested in books as a source of education or information, those are all signs that your child may be ready to begin literacy in any of the languages that are available to them. And I don't think there's any reason to hold off or to try to place one language before the other and be sure that one is in place before you add more.
okay, yeah, because learning one can always help the other, whether it's the home language that helps the school language or the school language that helps the home language.
Exactly. Yep. What's
And
important is
yeah,
that students are developing that rich linguistic repertoire, that
yeah,
extensive knowledge around the world, and that motivation to learn and to read.
yeah. And so I heard as well that many teachers discourage parents to teach their child to read in the home language before they start in school, because if like one parent starts teaching in one way, another parent with another language starts teaching in another way, etc. And when the teacher tries to teach the whole class, instead of having a homogeneous group that doesn't know anything, they all have different bits of information and they try to apply it. So it's more difficult for teachers. Is that something that's widespread from your knowledge or not?
Um, to me, I that sounds like the job of a teacher. All of our students are coming to us with different backgrounds and different skills and different experiences. And I believe it's on the teacher to get to know the student and figure out what strengths they have to build on. Because you're never going to have a classroom where everybody is starting from the same place.
Okay. So it's not, even if the teacher says don't do it, it doesn't mean we shouldn't. We can if we feel confident enough to start. And yeah, if not, we can leave it to school and then maybe use what they learn from school to help us teach our child our language.
Yeah, and I think kids too are really good at recognizing that there are ways of being in school and ways of being at home, and can switch between, at school I'm sounding words out letter by letter right now as we learn English, and at home I'm learning in this way. Um, and as we said before, I think there is still a lot of misconceptions out there about language learning. And so, yeah, I don't think that you necessarily need to, you know, not teach. I think it's good to support their literacy development when they're ready in whichever language they're interested in.
Okay, thank you. And so we hear a lot about the sense of reading and sense of language acquisition. And in your consultation work, you put a lot of effort in linking both. In the classroom, can you explain what is generally happening and how teachers could benefit from learning from both?
Yeah, so from my own experience, I think that can be generalized to what a lot of people are experiencing. We are trained in our teacher preparation programs in these very specialized areas, and there's not a lot of crossover between them. The effect is that we're teaching in silos in school. You have this student to teach them reading for 30 minutes. I have this student to teach them English for 30 minutes, and it becomes very compartmentalized. But we know that literacy is built on a foundation of language. So to separate the two doesn't make sense in terms of optimizing their learning path. Um, so I think that there's a real need for educators to share knowledge with each other, for there to be multidisciplinary teams that come together regularly to discuss the programs that are in the schools, the way that children are responding, what does the data show about how effective our instruction has been. And the other piece that I think is just really important, we talk a lot about inclusive schools and making sure that our students feel safe and welcomed and their voices are valued. But I have seen that English as a second language teachers often are kept to the margins of the schools as well. So we're teaching in closets, we're teaching in hallways, we're not always invited to the child study meetings to share our perspective or to the committee meetings where we're setting policies for the school that will affect multilingual learners. And I think that ensuring that all of the voices of your staff members are represented when you're making these decisions is really crucial to breaking down some of those silos and ensuring that we're using best practices for students based on all of the intersecting pieces to their learning. So a multilingual student is going to have a slightly different path to literacy than an English only student. And if the ESL teacher is not there to provide input and feedback about the policies that are being implemented, it's going to be to the detriment of the multilingual students in schools.
Yeah. I guess it's also on the school's job to organize that kind of places where they can communicate with each other. Because I'm thinking of like now I work in England as a teacher, and in my school we have quite a lot of meetings where it's not just in each department in isolation, but we're encouraged to share different like what we do in our department with the rest of the school, or to work on a certain problem, but with different subjects together working on it, instead of being just things in isolation. And that could help a lot because in France, for example, it's the opposite. And so I have never worked in France, so I don't see the whole picture. But I know that teachers can come when they start teaching, they go when they're finished teaching. In England, we need to be here the whole day, whether we teach a lot or not. So we have less time. So our teachers, I assume, have less time in France to communicate with each other. So I guess having a system where you can create these spaces or this time for people to work on things together is also important.
Absolutely. And there's been a big push, at least here in the States, toward co-teaching between the English language development teacher and the content area teachers. And um, co-teaching really only works if there is also time in the schedule for co-planning and co-assessment and co-reflection. And that is really hard to build into the schedule at schools. But if we're truly going to embrace a co-teaching model, those times need to be available to us.
Yeah. And I like to comment to another thing that we hear a lot. So like you were saying as well before that some teachers are not trained to teach multilingual children. So I guess it's to do with that as well. But we hear some teachers who could say um, like the parents are speaking to their child in their home language, so they're less exposed to English, for example, if it's an English speaking country. And that's why the child is struggling in class. Is what do you think of this saying that teachers might say?
I'm sorry. So what is
So,
the
so some teachers, when we say, for example, okay, this child is struggling in my subject, they might look at the fact that the student is EAL, so English as an additional language, or multilingual, to say that that that's the cause of why they're struggling. So maybe at home, because they hear a lot of their home language, then they don't spend enough time hearing English or maybe reading in English. So that's why they're struggling.
um so it's definitely not because they are using another language at home. We're in school for 6, 8 hours a day. That's plenty of immersion in English for it, to be able to use any language in the home without affecting that. I do think, there's some truth to that students who are learning English there is an achievement gap right now. But as soon as they close the proficiency gap, the achievement gap also closes. So it takes time to learn a language. And I think we can expect that English learners are going to take time to show their true potential when we're assessing them in English only, which ideally, if we have other means to assess them, we should be doing that. But I think it's really important to understand that the fact that they're developing the ability to show what they understand and know doesn't mean that they don't understand and know those things. So knowledge transfers across languages, experiences and skills transfer across languages. And just because our students are not yet able to express in English what they understand and know, doesn't mean that they're not still absorbing all of this information and have a wealth of knowledge and experiences to draw upon to understand the curriculum. I think about, I learned the water cycle when I was in fourth grade in English.
Yeah,
But if I was suddenly dropped into a classroom in France and they were teaching um, a lesson about the water cycle, I really only need to learn the new vocabulary to
yeah,
attach to the concept that I already understand. I don't need to relearn how the water cycle works. I just need to learn what language do I use to show that I understand this.
yeah. And there is, so recently I spoke to a teacher from another school about so what they were doing with multilingual learners, etc. And one thing that I found really good and that should be more widespread is that this teacher is a EAR teacher, and so she's in charge. So she took upon the task of translating all the assessments, so just the big assessments, into each child's home language. So when they do the test, they can either reply in English, so if they feel confident enough, but if they don't, they can write in their home language. And then, so she says it depends on the language as well, or how well written the text is from the child. But she uses or like a translator or people like in the staff to translate and to understand the ideas. But this could bridge the gap between the time when the child doesn't speak very well English, so can't really express his or her ideas well, and the time when they are proficient. So we don't think, okay, they don't understand because they can't explain the ideas, but more it's because of the language at the moment, but
Yep.
the understanding is there.
Yeah, and I think one of the exciting things about AI, for example, is that
Yeah,
um, it's easier to do that sort of assessment with students and to be able to I mean, you have to be careful that it's translated properly and all the rest, but I think particularly about one of the schools where I worked, where there were over 40 different languages represented. And back then, the idea of being able to translate things into those languages for the purposes of assessment was, we wouldn't be able to even find translators for some of the languages. But
yeah,
now that we have this technology, it's a lot easier to allow a student to write in their first language, and you can scan it in and try to understand what is the knowledge that they're bringing to this topic.
yeah. Yeah, and of course, the Chinese to be literate. So if they're too young and they don't know how to write yet, it doesn't work. But if they're proficient enough and they can write in their language, that's a huge benefit.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and when we would get newcomer students in third, fourth, and fifth grade, they often acquired English and literacy in English very quickly because they had that literacy foundation in their first language. And
Yeah,
I do think for kindergarten, first, and second grade students, it can be more challenging because in many cases, there's not already a fully functioning literacy system in any language. So you're building these understandings about print in a language that students are also developing at the same time, which, even for students who only ever have spoken English, making those connections between the squiggles on the page and the sounds that come out of your mouth is really, really challenging. So our multilingual learners have this added layer of complexity to navigate, but they also have this added resource to draw upon, which is the other languages that
yeah,
they speak.
which is a great way to a great word, sorry, to use the resource. So each language is a resource to improve the other languages.
Yes. And I think what the research is showing is that these languages don't exist separately in the brain. They're not stored in different places. It all contributes to this underlying repertoire, linguistic repertoire that is always functioning no matter what language you're currently using. The other languages are still active and helping you filter information and express yourself and form your perspective.
Yeah. And so now I would like to talk about the use of the science of reading and language acquisition, because so some might think, okay, I've learned in a certain way, why wouldn't it work with my child, etc. And to talk about why it's important to understand why we do things and to base it on science and not just my teacher told me that way, I can do the same. So there are different practices that vary across the world and also through time. So the way I learned is probably not the way a child in France now is learning, the same in any country. But can you explain what the science of reading has brought and what malpractice it has helped avoid, or it is
Sure.
helping avoiding?
Yeah. So in the United States, the science of reading is really sweeping in to replace balanced literacy practices, where um, science of reading leads to a structured literacy model where we're explicitly teaching students and systematically teaching the phonics curriculum, in addition to building a rich language comprehension. So the science of reading is based on the simple view of reading, which is that word recognition skills like decoding times language comprehension skills equals reading. And for multilingual students, of course, who are learning English, added to the end of that equation is English language development. And it's replacing a more an approach to reading where we would model a lot of a literate life to students. We would really lean into developing a love for reading and an identity of yourself as a reader, which are, of course, things that we want to maintain and bring forward with us into structured literacy. But the emphasis, at least in phonics, is that we're very systematically introducing the sounds that the letters make so that students are able to take a word and decode it themselves to break it apart. So with balanced literacy, often we would have students just look at the first letter of a word and then try to use the context of the story to figure out what it might have meant. And the research doesn't support that as an efficient way to read. Um, but the science of reading refers to the entire body of research around literacy. And I think in addition to explicit phonics instruction, one of the really important findings that it surfaced is how essential background knowledge is for reading comprehension,
Yeah.
which to me implies that for multilingual learners in particular, we want to be very intentional about building that background knowledge and connecting it to existing knowledge that they bring to the classroom already. Because again, that knowledge is going to transfer across languages and support them in their reading comprehension.
Okay.
And the
Thank you.
third thing, just
Yeah.
to say one more, and this comes not necessarily from the science of reading as much as from the field of second language acquisition, but it's very clear that, again, if the first language supports literacy acquisition in later languages. So not shutting down the use of the first language, integrating it into your instruction as much as possible is a really important piece to this as well.
Okay. Thank you. And just to talk about resources more concretely, because I'm sure there are some parents following us or who are going to watch this later who understand, okay, now, so there is a science behind how we can teach a child to read and write. There are things to do, not to do. If they are looking for resources, what would be your advice on what kind of thing to pick or maybe what to avoid? So maybe if you see something like this, it's not effective, or if you see something like that, this is going to be effective. Do you have any advice on this?
So the first thing I look for is the child interested in the material or in the book? I think it's really critical, again, from second language acquisition research, we know about the affective filter. And when the affective filter is low, students are able to acquire language more quickly and more efficiently. So selecting books that the student is truly interested to read, that they're excited to sit down and work through, even if it becomes difficult, I think is the number one piece to look for. And then I think it's helpful to consider the different components of the science of reading and see how well the materials support that. So, is this a book that helps build knowledge about the world, that will support reading comprehension and vocabulary? Is this a book that is decodable so that the student is developing phonics knowledge as well? Does this book have some repetition so that fluency starts to build and the child is exposed to the same language structures multiple times so they can start to acquire that structure? And of course, you're not going to find all of those elements in a single resource, but being able to recognize where your student or child is in terms of their language and literacy development helps you match them to the appropriate materials.
Yeah. I would like to clarify one point you made before about so when there is repetition, it helps the child learn. Um, so I think last time when we spoke, you're telling me that if there is too much repetition as well, the child would just guess what's written instead of reading it, actually. So where's the limit?
So going back to balanced literacy again, the initial books that we would give students would be very repetitive. It was usually sight words, so words that you could not sound out using phonics knowledge as a beginning reader. And then the last word of the sentence would be something that they would need to check the picture to figure out. So if it was a book about going to the zoo, each page would say something like, I see the lion, I see the zebra, I see the giraffe. So if your student can recognize visually the difference between I, C, and A, and they have the vocabulary when they check the picture, it looks like they're reading that book, but they haven't actually gained
Yeah.
phonics knowledge. And they're not actually, I mean, you could read the book without actually even looking at the words once you know what the pattern is. So you
Yeah.
want to avoid books like that. But I do think it's helpful to find books that have some repetitive elements to them, like folk tales and fairy tales, where there's often three events that lead up to the resolution.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
And so, or the gingerbread man, for example, where he's always saying, run, run as fast as you can. And that repetition pulls the student through the book and exposes them to the language multiple times.
Okay. And so you're writing books, but before we talk about your books, I would like to mention to our viewers, so two sessions especially to reinforce what you were saying. So there is one with Dr. Dova, which is at 4:30 UK time on the importance of emotions. So you're talking about motivation, liking the results, etc. So what's the importance of emotions when we learn something, not necessarily reading or writing, but in the learning process. And then another one, which is a pre-recorded interview with a speech and language therapist. It was pre-recorded because she is French, so it's Laura Marie. She's French, and so the video is going to be put online on Monday with subtitles, so you can understand, anyone can understand, because we go through loads of precise examples of how to remember this, what's good, what's bad. So I invite you to check that as well later.
Great.
And so now we'd like to talk about your books. So if you could, so what book is it? Does it help children do? Yeah.
Sure. So it's actually my initial launch of Dovetail Readers. They have not yet been printed, but hopefully are forthcoming soon. And you can go to my website, dovetailreaders.com, to download a sample story. I have the three little pigs there.
Yeah.
And so I chose folk tales because of several reasons. One, that it has that natural repetition built into the structure of the stories. It's a collection of 5 different folk tales that are commonly taught in the United States in kindergarten, first and second grade classrooms. But I wrote them in a graphic novel format because I think, well, number one, kids love graphic novels of all ages. I love graphic novels. But also I think of a lot of newcomers who come in third or fourth grade, or maybe have interrupted formal education and are reading at a fairly beginner level for literacy, but don't want to look like they're reading a baby book next to their
Yeah.
peers who are reading more advanced books. So I wanted to make it, again, bring that affective filter down and make them excited to read it and not feel stigmatized at all that they're in an early reader book. And then the text is all decodable at the earliest levels with short vowel sounds and closed syllables. So I'm really excited to bring it out into the world, and it's been a lot of work, but I'm hoping that it really helps students and teachers kind of bring some joy into reading and build that knowledge that kids who have grown up hearing these folk tales and stories in the United States have, and then also developing literacy skills and enjoyment alongside it.
Thank you very much. And so just a reminder that Catherine is giving away one copy of her book. You can find the details in the program on her page. Yeah, and so now I would like to ask, so we're talking about decodable books. So when children are really starting to learn to read, right at the beginning, once they're able to decode words, what's the next step to help them develop their literacy?
So we want to be sure English is a difficult language. The orthography is very opaque. And once they have the basic decoding skills, it doesn't stop there. We want to be sure that we're teaching advanced phonics patterns in a systematic way as well. And also that we're starting to pull in morphology instruction and understanding how the different parts of words help us understand what they mean. Because comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading and something that we need to be developing in an ongoing fashion. But what's really exciting to me is that language acquisition is driven by input, which is really only listening and reading are the only two real available sources of input for people who are learning language. So when students are not yet able to read, they're limited to acquiring language through what they hear. But as soon as they become independent readers, this new source of input, which is, almost infinite for all of the written texts out there, becomes available to them. And that can be a big accelerant of language acquisition as well. So while you're developing these literacy skills, your language is growing quickly alongside of it.
Yeah, and so I can testify on this because I can see it with my sons. So first, what you said about comic books and what's great is so when my sons were starting to be able to read, so in French or Korean, I remember that they were reading mainly the onomatopoeia, but the picture was saying most of it, but it was so like it looked so funny that they wanted to know what was happening, so they started to read more. And that's what got them to practice reading and to become more fluent. And about the vocabulary that you're saying that can expand, like my sons really enjoyed a comic book, a Korean comic book that's about a brother and sister who keep fighting about everything. But because it uses exactly the kind of words and expressions they would be using at their age, it has made their speech a lot more natural. So when they speak in Korean, like my wife is telling me that they sound really natural, they have a wide range of vocabulary. In French, so the comic books they read, I feel that some expressions are a bit old. Like I used to say that as a child, but I don't think people are saying that now. Like children are saying that now, and so there is a gap between both. But yeah, so but reading comic books can definitely expand the vocabulary.
Yeah, and it can be tricky finding books that, especially graphic novels and comic books that are at the right sort of language and reading level for kids because they can use very advanced language, but there are so many natural supports built into them with the, wordless panels that show action and the step-by-step changes in the way that characters' faces are responding to the events and they can track the emotions as they change. There's a lot of support for the comprehension, even if they're not able to understand every word or decode every word on the page.
Yeah. And we have a comment from Daniel or Daniele who said that it's really important for learning a heritage language. So especially when children are less exposed to the language, it's great to have other sources of input.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is a good point. developing, if your child does come to school without already having literacy in their first language and they become a reader in English, that's, the transfer works both ways. You can use that English literacy to support developing literacy in the heritage language. And then you do have another tie that, keeps that heritage language around, because there's a real risk of losing the first language as well, especially over successive generations. And it's important to build that and build the emotional connection and identity with the first language.
Thank you. And so to finish, I would like to know if you have any final thoughts or anything, an important message you would like to share with the parents or teachers who are watching us. Yeah,
Sure.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think my biggest message is to view multilingualism as an asset and a resource, not something to shut down so that we can acquire the target language more quickly. And also just, again, the importance of working together and sharing our expertise across disciplines and really reaching out to be sure that everybody is represented at the table when important decisions are being made. And for parents who may feel, unsure about how much they can advocate for their child at school, I really encourage you to do so. It really, yeah, it's important to speak up. And even if it's just the English as a second language teacher that you feel comfortable talking with, allow them to then be the voice and advocate for your child within the school, because I know that navigating the school system can be a challenge. It can be frustrating. It can be confusing. But it's really important for the success of our students that we're all working together.
Thank you. And yeah, just to remind everyone that this is also one reason we're creating this event is to get experts and researchers to talk about various aspects of multilingual literacy. So if you think that one video is particularly helpful for you to get your point across, I think that's the expression, to get your point across with your child's school, feel free to send them the video or an extract of it to help them understand your position as well. And so we're coming to the end of this interview, but I would like to thank you again very much for being here and for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And so for the viewers, we have our next session at 2 o'clock, and we'll be talking with Hannah King about how to create a multilingual library in schools. So I see you very soon. And thank you very much, Daniele. She's a great initiative. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I see you, everyone. I see everyone very soon. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I know it must take a huge amount of time and effort to put together such a comprehensive event, and I'm really excited to learn from the speakers that you have lined up. So thank you for having me here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.